It's over there. Do you have anything you want to discuss at this time, Nick, or do you want to wait for the for the work session?
Trying to think if there was anything that I needed to update the commission on. Probably the only thing, this is kind of more of an FYI for you because it doesn't necessarily involve the Landmarks Commission necessarily, but it might, is that the City Council is going to be discussing some changes to our sign ordinance that allows, well, one defines a vintage sign and allows it to be relocated, reused, etc. When it meets those qualifications for vintage signs. So it's a way for us to help preserve kind of the more historic types of signs that may be outside of historic districts. There's a lot of them in Sugar House, for example, a lot of them along the State Street or Main Street corridor. So that's just an FYI. The City Council is going to start talking about that in a couple of weeks. So just one of the things that we're trying to do to help with some of our preservation goals that are also outside of historic districts. So.
Okay. Well, good. Thank you very much. So no involvement then imagined for us? I mean,
not right now. One of the benefits is that right now the Landmarks Commission has kind of, and same with the Planning Commission, had really limited authority on reusing existing signs when they're historic and stuff. So this actually opens that gateway. So, and I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head, and I can't really. Probably Exchange Place downtown might be one where there's some, but there may be some that would come before the Landmarks Commission for review, and we're doing that as a special exception. So
okay, good, very good. I have two cards actually. That one's for one of the projects. If anyone wants to speak to any of the projects or the applications tonight, please fill out one of these cards and just bring it up to me. But we do have Cindy Cromer who wishes to speak to a non-project specific matter.
So I'm still Cindy Cromer, but if there were a casting for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I would get cast as the dwarf known as Grumpy, because I'm always saying things could be better and that the streetscape isn't adequately conveyed and that the historical context is not being respected, and on and on and on. But because I'm always so watchful, when something turns out well, I feel compelled to tell you. So the project that you looked at, known as 935, on 9th East, just west of Haxton Place, and abutting and part of the South Temple Historic District, is now finished and leasing. And this was one that the staff was stellar. Amy Thompson wrote a negative staff recommendation about a very aggressive upzone. And then you worked very hard on the articulation of the part of the building, especially that was in the historic district. And the building has turned out fabulously well. Even the part that we didn't fuss over with the recreation facility in the back has turned out really well. The articulation of the porches and balconies is fabulous. These folks even matched the color of the dryer vents to the color of the exterior building materials. I was thrilled. So thank you for all of your hard work on that. The only way it could have been much better is if the entire facade had been in the historic district.
Yes. Then
you could have monkeyed around with the setback for the whole front of the building. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. I have not been by it, but I've heard other people give similar reports on it. We'll need to do in fact, the commission, I think in the near future, we're going to have sort of a traveling, I don't know if we can have a traveling meeting, probably not technically, but we'll figure that out. But I think revisiting projects, past projects, to learn how they turned out. We see them in drawing form, we see them in some photo renderings and things like that. How do they really turn out in construction is an important thing I think for us to learn from. With that, let's start item number 1 on the agenda, the project at 275 North Vine Street. Oh, that's right. And Paul?
I have a conflict of interest on this item, so I'm just going to step out for the first agenda item.
That still leaves us with quorum, so we're good.
All right. Thank you, Chair. Hello and good evening. You will recall this proposal was before you, the meeting in early June, and that was for the construction of 3 attached townhomes and the demolition of a non-contributing structure on the site. At that meeting, the Commission decided to approve the demolition of the non-contributing structure. So that is no longer part of this evening's review. At that point in time, and I'll go into this in slightly greater detail, the Commission decided to table the proposal for the new construction to address several issues by way of introduction this evening. A reminder on the site itself and where it is, generally bracketed by larger multifamily buildings. RMF 75 residential zone. There is an adjacent single-story, single-family contributing residence. I believe the owner of that residence is here this evening and may wish to speak. The rest of the context is generally apartment buildings. And just as a reminder as well, there was a previous approval for demolition of the existing building and the development of a single-family house on this site, which the Commission approved in June of 2015. Brief summary on the new construction once more for those who weren't here previously. 3 attached units, 3 stories high, 4 stories to the rear with a roof terrace. Staggered plan facing Vine Street, generally reflecting the curve in the street alignment. Frontage along Vine Street has a 2-story porch definition. There is rear access tandem garage parking with the drive access on the south side of the site. And the primary materials proposed are brick, stucco, and cedar cladding, I believe. Briefly, photographs of the existing building on the site, also including the adjacent single-family house next door. Looking northward past the site, and then southward along Vine Street. Zooming into the site itself and the existing buildings, just by way of reminder. And recapping, as I said previously, demolition of the non-contributing building was approved. Commission discussion at the meeting in June focused on the relationship of the building to the street and concern about the settlement patterns and the immediate neighborhood. Discussion points focused on the scope for the development to actually activate the street to a greater extent. Some discussion of volume and height of the building and glazed frontage, volume of glass, the frontage, and the lack of a street elevation along Vine Street. The applicant has provided some additional information addressing those various points and some revisions to this proposal in that context. This is a previous application sheet. This has not changed from the first version that you would have seen. This has the addition of a new street elevation along the top of this particular sheet, setting the proposed building in context. It was previously expressed in outline only. This has been revised to include some more detailed perspectives of the Vine Street frontage and the use of the redesign of the porchways, really, to make them usable for the residents, and to activate the street frontage itself in response to previous commission concerns. And this has also been revised to so much for the screen, yeah, quite. This sheet has been revised to include the revised details of the proposed building, top right-hand corner, going into those in slightly greater depth. There are some perspectives here, and I think on the next slide, these have since been revised slightly in response to some commentary from the immediate neighbor. There are some revised perspectives actually in your Dropbox. I have some extra copies here if anybody needs one, which actually improve the accuracy of these, I think it's fair to say. And again, the new street facade elevation above in this particular view. And setting out the site plan itself and perspective looking down the street. That perspective down to the bottom left has also been revised. You will have that in your packet elsewhere. Zooming into the details as they have been revised since our initial discussions on the proposal. And then those perspectives in greater detail, addressing those points. Brief word on public representations by the meeting on the 7th of June. There have been 2 email comments received focused on loss of historic homes and then the safety values of the street and the adverse effect on residents, visitors, drivers and pedestrians, and objections from the adjacent owners on height and proximity, need for boundary wall, concern regarding the impact upon foundations and parking. Capitol Hill Community Council also raised a point on pedestrian safety and traffic in this street. There has been some additional material which you will have received since that initial discussion, improving the perspective views following those being questioned, reconfirmed concern relating to the boundary wall on the south side of the site, and also reconfirmation of the concern about impact on foundations. Excuse me. With the suggestion the driveway might be moved to the other end of the site. There's also been an objection from the resident, a resident to the west, concerning the impact of previous development on stability of that slope. I don't have any further detail on that one, but apparently there have been issues. So, focusing back in on the key issues, which we were left with following the previous Commission's discussion. Streetscape and perspective views, attention has been given to both of those with some revised details, some revised renderings. Those have been forwarded to you and have been further reviewed. I think the applicant hopes to address those in slightly greater detail as well. And that would conclude my summary at this point. At this point, the recommendation before you is that based on the analysis and the findings listed in the staff report, a testimony received and proposal presented, I recommend that the Historic Landmark Commission approve the application PLN HLC 2018-00219. New construction of 3 attached single-family dwellings with the following condition, that design details are delegated to staff for approval. And I would conclude there and pass it over to you for any additional thoughts, concerns, questions. Sure.
So do you think that this,
Microphone, a little bit.
do you think the streetscape is so sort of mismatched and it's not really continuous enough with a single theme that it can't really be said that it matches anything or fits in because there's really nothing to fit in with? Or do you think that it does fit in with the streetscape, and if so, why?
That's several questions.
There's actually two. It's saying, is the
Gotcha, right.
streetscape too chaotic for you to say,
I know,
yeah, it
yeah,
matches it?
I know,
Is there a consistent theme
Yeah.
and it matches it?
I know exactly what you mean. It's a very unique circumstance, and especially when you look at the entire length of Vine Street. So that's the essential point in terms of the disparate nature of the character and the scale of the buildings along that street frontage. Focusing further in the immediate context is the single-family house next door, and then the two adjacent three-story multifamily buildings either side of that again. It's probably fair to say that in the overall context, and certainly in the more immediate context, the proposal is relatively compatible with the general scale and character. It's
There's a flat roof. What things were you looking at?
I think one's looking at the definition of the building itself, the fact that yes, it has a flat roof. It also staggers, which actually breaks down the massing and the scale. It has a two-story series of front porches, which also helps to reduce the scale. I think the street slopes further down at that point, which means that the impact has been slightly reduced in relation to the relative height proposed as alongside the single-family house. And I think it's creating a definition of human scale relatively effectively in terms of that sort of tripartite breakdown, and also the sort of the further massing and definition that the two-story porches bring to the frontage. The fact that the staggering of the units actually reflects the street curving street alignment also, I think, helps, because we never see it in this particular form. You're kind of appreciating it from various angles as the street slopes both directions. So I mean, maybe that hopefully summarizes a number of the points. And it is an RMF 75 zone, which means they've got a 75-foot ceiling, theoretically, leaving aside the sort of the context in terms of historic character and setting.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
Carl, can you just back up the slides to, actually, I can't remember if there were photo renderings from both directions on the street towards it, but the views where it was in context, pasted into the context of the street.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was that one, yes, and that one.
And these, as I was saying when we cantered through these have been revised to be slightly more accurate, I think it's pretty fair to say, and I think the applicant would hope to address that point as well. Because in this one you see slightly more of the adjacent house than I think you probably see in reality. I think the revised perspective comes slightly further forward than this particular perspective.
In this case, right at the center joint, I guess, between the screens is the existing building to the left. Is that correct?
Yes,
That's
yes, it
being
is.
demolished.
Yeah. But as in terms of the material that you would have received since then, the more accurate and revised perspective, you no longer see that building, and it comes further forward, obscuring much more of the adjacent house.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff? If not, we invite the applicant up to augment staff presentation, respond to the issues that have been raised previously. And
Give you the hot seat there.
So the Commission asked me to address several points. I want to go over these now. The design guidelines, section 12.6, describe that a new building should appear similar in scale to the established scale of the current street block. And so that's why we did this study, which shows, Carl, how do you navigate through this? Okay. So these are what is shown on these boards. The building is an RMF 75, and which is 75-foot maximum height. And these two lines in the red and the black, I apologize, I'm pointing at the boards, show the average height of the building is actually in black, and the maximum height of 75 feet is that red line. And as you can see, the project is well below that maximum height, and well below the average height of the buildings on the street block. Which is, again, the measurement is established scale of the current street block. So not the house next door, not the entire neighborhood, but the street block. Since the site is an RMF 75, it's small, it's very irregular shaped. The design guidelines call or encourage creative solutions that are compatible with the established character of the neighborhood, which I think we've done. And then the district is generally, it is preferable to be able to perceive the evolution of the street and neighborhood, discerning the apparent age of each building by its architectural expression and method of construction, meaning that we shouldn't do a fake old building, and we should do a real building that reflects today's architecture and construction methods, which I think we've done. The contours of the landscape and curved street influence the massing of the building. So as you can see in the perspective, as the street curves, so do the buildings, and the massing of each house is a lot less prominent because they're stepping back. So each house is not as prominent as it could be in terms of scale. So we broke that scale down as it recedes along the street, and we also broke the scale of this 3-story townhome down to a 2-story porch. So effectively, the perceived height as you are on the sidewalk is a lot shorter than the actual height. The entrance is oriented towards the street, which follows the design guidelines and functions as a social interface. I think it's important to point out that the project doesn't have any backyard. So we are turning these houses towards the front of the street, and I know that was one of your main concerns. I also made some changes to the front porch, and so now it actually has a rail, and it is connected to the stairs, and it really is an extension to the house. So that was from the last meeting that we had. And I think it effectively connects the buildings to the street, and it addresses the street. I wanted to remind the Commission that we are not asking for any additional height. We're not asking for additional setbacks, and we are not asking for any additional density. There are 2 units on the site. We're replacing it with 3, and the 3 are allowed by the zoning. So we're not asking for anything along these lines. The building or the project is very considerate and very sensitive to the neighborhood and the existing home on the left. We put a driveway in between, therefore creating a 12-foot space between our building and the property line, which means there's a 16-foot space between the 2 buildings now, as opposed to even the previous building was only 8 feet away from the original building, and in some spots even closer to that. Do you want me to address the questions now that were raised through the emails?
I think it would be a good idea, yes,
Okay.
take this opportunity.
There were several questions. One related to the excavation during construction. So we want to reassure the neighbors that the building is basically three standard homes next to each other, and so we're not contemplating any piers or any kind of different footings. The footing and foundation would be residential in nature and would just extend just to be out of the frost line. So nothing exotic and nothing that should cause any more vibrations. We wanted to note that there was a fault excavation done on the project, and that's a 10-foot trench that was required to do because we're in a fault zone. That test passed. So we dug a 10-foot deep trench, and nothing happened. So, or at least nothing that I know of. So we don't plan on doing anything more intrusive than that. The driveway, I know there was a concern about cars possibly sliding from one property to the other. I mean, it's no different than any other property in the area, but the neighboring site is actually 2 feet higher than our driveway. And the proposed driveway is actually following the existing grade. So for a car to go onto the neighboring property, it would have to go up a 2-foot wall. So we feel that's a pretty reasonable way to solve that problem. Furthermore, we could heat the driveway so that there's no car sliding, but it's, like I said, it's nothing unusual in the neighborhood. People have driveways. Lastly, there was a concern about the fire truck access, and we met with Teddy Chon and addressed all his concerns. And I might add that these last 3 comments, even though we paid attention and we wanted to provide a response, will all be addressed through a different method, meaning that they will be reviewed at the building permit stage. Thank you for your time. Do you have any questions?
Questions for the applicant? Maybe just one clarification, Pierre. You talked about the property line issue and the 2-foot elevation difference. Is there an existing retaining wall between the properties? Will there be there is an existing retaining wall down the property line roughly, or?
Yes, it is about, you can see at the very edge of the street, it's about maybe 1.5 feet. Then as you go deeper, it gets to about 2 feet, and then it recedes towards the back of the property. The 2 properties are almost leveled, maybe 1 foot of difference.
So that's an existing structural element there, I mean a retaining wall element.
Right.
Okay. Other questions for the applicant or the architect? Thank you very much for the graphics and the presentation. I have one public comment request from Kelly Badger. It's kind of sort of an optional if desired. So if you'd like to.
Wanted to provide a little bit of clarification on the...
Make sure that microphone is on.
It's green.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Just clarification with the boundary wall that goes between the 2 properties. At the point our home starts, it is flush with the ground's level to the house next door. So there's a retaining wall in the front of our house, but where our house actually starts, it's flush. So there would have to be some sort of barrier put there. I see a lot of cars slide in the snow, and I'd hate for some car to hit our home, especially being 2 feet from our foundation.
Okay, thank you very much. Sections there. So, I don't know if you need to, Pierre, if you want to respond to that, or if you do, you need to come to the microphone, but
I'm sorry.
that's fine.
So there's a traffic department, and we tend to meet with them and fully comply with their recommendations during the building permit process.
In your drawings, you don't happen to have a section, a north, east and west section, north and south sections down the property line? That would have been a perhaps helpful thing for us.
That wasn't required in the application,
Sure.
and I don't think it's pertinent to this process.
Okay.
We're not here to review driveways, as far as I'm aware.
I agree. There is sort of a curious actual physical preservation of historic properties, though, that is sort of a factor here, I think, that we have to
We are
consider.
not planning on touching the grade on that side of the project. We're keeping the existing grade, as I mentioned.
Okay.
So that should not be an issue.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff or applicant? If not, we'll go into executive session to consider this application now. Please, someone speak, though.
I'll start up. I think the applicant's done a good job in responding to the issues that were raised at our last meeting, and I have no concerns about what's being shown to us tonight. And if no one else wants to speak, I would be willing to put forth a motion.
Well, I'll speak for a minute. I really, really like the contemporary metaphor of porch in this design. I think porches are very important to our streetscape in any neighborhood, especially in historic districts. And furthermore, the rhythm, the massing, the staggered setback, I think this will be a wonderful addition to the streetscape.
I think they're waiting, Kenton.
All right, I would like to make a motion. Based on the analysis and findings listed in this staff report, testimony received, and the revised proposal presented, I recommend that the Historic Landmarks Commission approve the application PLN HLC 2018-00219, new construction of 3 attached single-family dwellings, with the following condition: that approval of details is delegated to staff.
We have a motion
Seconds.
and a second. Is there any discussion? If not, we'll vote. Kenton, do you want to start at your end? Oh, Bob, sorry, you blended over there. I'm sorry, Bob.
Aye.
My apologies.
Aye.
Aye.
Richardson, aye.
Stowe, aye.
Harding, aye.
So the motion passes and the application is approved. Very much. Let's see, let's move to. We'll now move to item number 2 on the agenda, the rear addition proposed for the dwelling at 774 East 3rd Avenue.
That's what he's previously had. Ours is down there. I think that was just a PDF though, rather than a PowerPoint. Yeah. Well, it kind of scrolled anyway, but thanks.
Earl, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. The second item before you this evening is concerns 774 3rd Avenue. It's a proposal for a rear addition and special exception approvals to go with that proposed addition. In summary, and I'll come back to this in slightly greater detail, this is a single-story historic cottage. The proposal is for a 2-story rear addition that replaces an agglomeration of later lean-to additions, retaining the original historic rear addition. and is set slightly to one side of the rear of the property. There is also a proposal to put a new accessory structure in one corner of the site. Special exceptions sought here are for an inline addition to the existing house, and that involves increase in roof height, approximately 3 above zoning maximum, approximately 3 feet 4 inches, and wall height approximately 2 feet 3 inches. There's also a slight encroachment into a side setback. That just covers what's just been mentioned. The only other additional point there is that the proposal also includes the replacement of the existing windows in the cottage. Those have previously been replaced. And I think the proposal at the moment is to replace the current vinyl frames with a more durable fiberglass alternative, which has better profiles as well. A word or two on the building and its immediate context on 3rd Avenue. I described the rear historic addition as a lean-to. It's actually not a lean-to. It's got a hip roof to it and a central chimney, so that's a minor correction on my part. It replaces several sections of rear addition, which are more recent than that, and not of any historic interest. The proposal is for a 2-story rear addition, which is unusual. And it is on a smaller footprint, and I will come back to that in greater detail shortly. The proposal in design terms echoes aspects of the existing cottage. It's side-gabled in orientation and uses the same roof pitch. And other points to note in this particular case is the site falls to the rear from north to south. The addition is partly constrained. I think the applicant has been focusing on keeping floor-to-floor heights to a minimum, but they're trying to retain an historic root cellar to the rear of the existing property, and consequently have not been able to dig the rear addition into the site any more than what is currently proposed in retaining access to that root cellar. The house and site themselves, we'll come back to again in a moment, quite unusual. The historic cottage is set considerably further back in the street from a number of the other buildings, and certainly the 2 adjacent buildings, which are also much taller. And the primary external materials proposed here for the rear addition include an external cedar rain screen to the fabric of the structure. Location on 3rd Avenue. As you will see here to the immediate west, there is a relatively recent, certainly in this case non-contributing multifamily building of 2 to 3 stories, and to the immediate east is a fairly tall 1.5 story contributing house. There's some photographs of those in a moment or two. As you can see to an extent as well, the footprint of the cottage is set well back from the front setback established by the buildings either side, and the buildings on that the rest of that street frontage. Looking across the street into 3rd Avenue at the cottage itself and its immediate setting. Zooming in on the cottage. And then down the east side and the west side of that. You can see stepping slightly further out the historic addition to the rear that's being retained. You would be aware to an extent, although it steps in slightly, of the 2-story addition above that. The view from the parking lot to the rear of the multifamily building adjacent to the west side, you can see the rear of the house on the other side of the fence, and the rear historic addition to be retained, plus parts of the later additions, which are going to be removed with this proposal. And then briefly coming back to the 2007 historic architectural survey photograph of the house. Moving on to the application plans, showing the footprint of the new addition to the rear. As you can see, it steps in from the west side, steps in very marginally from the east side. So it actually, compared with the demolition sections of the existing additions to the rear, it's markedly more compact, but it is much taller. And then the location of the additional accessory building on the bottom corner of the site. Moving on to the plans themselves, as currently proposed. The rear addition, as you will see, has a cutaway for a rear entranceway on the west side, and then at the next level has a cutaway balcony on the southeast corner. Axonometrics, looks like this graphic slipped a little bit, I missed it. Showing the proposed addition relative to the cottage and its rear addition from various angles. Street elevation, placing the proposal in context, which is a difficult thing to achieve at the moment because there's a series of mature trees in front of the existing house, which makes a view of anything there from across the street directly fairly difficult. But there's a block elevation diagram below as well, indicating the relative heights and location of the proposal. The elevations as proposed at the moment, giving you a more detailed look at how the proposed would interact with the existing and the degree to which it is set back from the historic cottage. And then the rear new accessory building to the corner of the site. Couple of sections here placing the proposal in its context, looking both east and west, giving a relative massing idea of what else happens there. And whereas proposing a two-story addition to the rear of a single-story cottage is unusual, this is a fairly unusual context as well, in terms of its setting and the existing fabric. And then in discussions with the applicant, we considered it might be useful to actually have sections through the proposal indicating the impact or the relative location of the historic root cellar and the location of the proposed rear addition, giving you a perspective on how that actually works. And details of the construction and the windows proposed. A few details of the proposed materials. Okay, coming back to the special exceptions here, so this is a narrow lot as defined by the SR1A standards, which would define life as requiring a 50-foot wide lot. This is a 41-foot wide lot. This is a fairly historic cottage. It's the inline addition as proposed here, and for which approval is sought, would encroach 1 foot into the 4-foot side yard setback requirement. And the maximum roof height, as I mentioned previously, the exception sought would be an additional 3 feet 4 inches, and wall height 2 foot 3 inches with this proposal. The key issues here, as defined in the staff report, really focus on, there are several issues, but I mean, they really focus on the first one. And that's the height of the addition. 2 stories behind a 1-story house. That, as a rule, we generally would not readily find that a compatible way to go. However, actually looking at the setting of this house, the sort of the stature of the existing, how far back it is actually positioned from the street, and the fact that it's well back relative to the setbacks established by adjacent buildings either side and further along the street, the fact that those are much larger buildings as well. The design approach here has carefully chosen, I think it's pretty fair to say, to echo aspects of the existing cottage massing and profile with a certain degree of success. Obviously one could reduce the maximum roof pitch height by reducing the roof pitch. The applicant, having considered that, has concluded that they would like to match what they already have rather than reduce that roof pitch on this proposal. So from a street perspective point of view, street views are very effectively obscured by adjacent buildings and mature trees. As I say, I think the form and design is relatively sympathetic, and in this particular case, the staff conclusion was that this was much more acceptable than one might automatically assume that it would be. Other key issues identified here, as mentioned in passing already, the design of the new addition seems to have been well thought through in relation to the character of the existing house, but also in the individuality of the proposal and its compatibility echoes really in the context of both the house and I think the setting as well. New accessory structure does not raise any particular issues, I don't think, in any respect. It uses matching design and materials to the proposed rear addition, and the replacement of the windows does not raise any concern because we're not losing any existing historic character in the cottage, and this would be a marginal upgrade to what's currently there. So staff conclusion in this case is a positive recommendation for this two-story rear addition, and the recommendation before you in your report reads that based on the analysis and the findings listed in the staff report, staff recommends that the Commission approves the application for certificate of appropriateness for the new addition, construction of the accessory building and replacement of the windows, and approve the special exception requests associated with these proposals, with the condition that approval of details is delegated to staff. And I would conclude my summary presentation at that point and open it up for any thoughts, questions,
Any questions for
expressions of concern.
Carl at this time? Not, why don't we have the applicant come forward and make presentation, augment your presentation, Carl. Thank you very much.
And I don't know that the applicant has a presentation, but certainly is willing to answer questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we have anything really to add. Thank you, Carl, but we are available for questions.
Okay. Then, and do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Hannah Vaughn, the architect on the project.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. We might need to think just for a moment. Don't go away.
Well, Hannah, I've got a question. I don't know that it's strictly historical, but you've got large expanses of glazing, especially to the south, and no shading. I know you're using some really excellent windows on the project, but you're going to be getting a lot of direct sun there and on the west side. What are your thoughts on controlling insulation?
On the window that may be we've certainly discussed putting shading in front of the windows, so turning the cedar louvers sideways in order to cover the window if they want to. There's also the potential of using external shading systems, which we've used in other projects. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily something I thought was necessary to bring to this table, but I'm happy to extrapolate on it.
Well, I'm glad to hear you've considered it.
Yeah.
And I know the existing cottage doesn't have anything like that, and it's not traditional. Usually shading was provided by roof overhangs. But in a contemporary interpretation, when you're taking a design cue from the form of the historical building, yet you're doing it in a modern sense, I was curious to hear how you might be considering doing that. So,
Yeah, I think we'd probably try to conceal it actually as much as possible, or integrate it into the smoothness of the envelope. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Other questions? If not, I'll go ahead, Paul. Oh, I'll weigh in on mine. It may all be related. I think Carl has correctly identified that the issue is the height. I find the form and the massing and things, with the exception of the height, quite interesting and intriguing with respect to this historic house. But the height is really challenging to me. And there was the comment made about the root cellar and the height of the root cellar door and such. And the section that you have on your sheet A302 and the plans seem to show that the addition is immediately to the east of the stairs to the root cellar. Can you help me walk through how the root cellar stairs and access generate the need for the height? Because I think that's in my opinion, that's the single issue that I have some real trouble with, though. And while you're finding your section, thank you for the section. I may not have been required, but it's information that's very, very helpful.
So I guess maybe the first thing is in effort to maintain and preserve the integrity of that building, we're not adding any openings to the south side of the existing
Right.
structure.
Okay.
So we're using an existing door and using that as the new access point. So it's basically that if we lower that floor any further, we won't be able to. We would have to effectively. Currently, it's accessed via a porch. So if we lower the floor any further, then the porch is going to be higher than the floor, which I think causes a number of different issues. Namely, you step down into your home, and if we can't really lower that level because the beam above the doorway wouldn't allow the owners to access their already sort of short cellar door, which is already basically 6 feet tall.
Right. But
Does that make sense? It's a little.
I can appreciate the attachment to the existing and the need to maintain that opening and that floor height.
Yeah.
Could in plan, it seemed like some of the stairs, and I'll just describe it this way, some of the actual risers going upstairs to the new addition, the second floor of the new addition, if those were brought into the addition height, and that's not making any sense, and I recognize it, and it's...
No, it is honestly a little bit tricky to talk about.
Kenton, help me out. How can I describe this better? I mean, so you have a run of stairs up to the upper floor that's about a dozen or 14 or 15 risers.
What's the floor-to-floor height in the?
It's 9'7".
So we have a lot of risers going up, and could not some of these risers be relocated? There's a redesign aspect here, but I think it's still, I guess it takes floor ceiling height out of that area.
Our
right there, maybe.
base floor level, so we step down from the existing structure, one step down into the addition, which is basically, and if we can't go down any lower, otherwise we will start to obscure the head height access into the root cellar.
But doesn't the root cellar accessed in a linear from down the stairs and straight in?
Yes, so there's a porch that you access that from, and basically the small edge of the deck. So the deck is flush with the floor of the addition, which is the current level of the addition and the
Sure.
porch.
Of course, the current addition is 8 feet tall and not really tall, not 2 stories tall.
It's even less than that.
Yeah. I think redlining, we could communicate it easier, but I think I'll just end my question there. But I think the height, overall height of is very challenging. So I'll leave it as a statement, sorry. Paul, do you want to follow? Other questions for the architect? Okay, thank you very much. I don't have any public comment cards on this project, on this application, so unless someone waves quickly, we'll move into executive session. We'll do it. I apologize for my question turning into statements and things, but
Mr. Chair, I'm going to say that I really do not have an issue with the height here. I think within the context of the micro neighborhood, and there was a graphic up there earlier that showed this, I think it's architecturally more important to match the roof pitch than it is to fall within the confines of the SR1A height limits.
right.
And this body exists to grant these types of special exceptions. I think this is a fabulous example of a project that does not disturb the neighborhood and fits within the height confines of its neighbors.
Well, what about the 8.11 that requires that an addition be subordinate?
I think it's subordinate through its setback and stepping back from the street. I think Carl articulated that quite well.
It looks
and
sort of looming when you look at the...
Yeah, but I think the way that the ground steps away, and we look at it in context of its neighbors, and it's set back from the street, the house is way set back from the street. In fact, do you see the human figure in the lower picture, or both pictures? I think we'd see a glimpse of this, but it's not as looming, I think, in reality as we see it.
I wouldn't even use the word looming. I'd say when seen from the street, it would be intriguing.
I like that.
You've got a hint of something going on, but it isn't in your face. So I don't have a concern with the height myself either, for the reasons David has articulated.
I don't have any concerns about it either. I think it's actually quite modest given how narrow it is compared to the main house. And in terms of the architectural detailing, I'm really excited about it. I can't wait to have this be in my little neighborhood. I think it's terrific. The only other thing I was going to say is just on a more philosophical note. I think these tiny little houses, and in this case, one with a significant part of the square footage in the back, I'm guessing just from looking at it, is pretty much unusable. That these are the kinds of houses that run the risk of losing their utility over time. And I think that giving some latitude to creative solutions to increase the square footage and make it more palatable to a broader group of people is what's going to keep that front house being well cared for another 100 years. So I'm a big thumb up on this one.
Are there other comments? I would still, just as I think there's ways to depress and to avoid the looming. I think looming is still a word.
I agree, but I think it's unnecessary.
But if it's achievable, necessary and achievable is kind of an interesting dichotomy, I think.
Let's throw another word in. Is it needed?
The roof height.
Needed. Yeah, I think that's.
Is it necessary? No. Is it achievable? Yes, if you wish, but I don't think it's needed.
Correct.
We could keep the roof height and pull a foot out of the floor to cathedral ceiling height, but I don't think you're really gaining anything with that, and you're losing a bit of the nice volume inside the house that's being created. that's going to be a great space to live in. I think it's going to be light-filled and open, and really tie the backyard into the living of the house.
I just feel like this is a pretty unique, it is a unique little structure. One of the older buildings in the avenue is probably remarkably small, remarkably short, kind of oddly set on its site. And I just kind of feel like we should be doing what we can to retain those characters.
And I think this proposal will retain that character by being radically different.
Well, it's one way. I fully agree with the comments that have been made. Paul's in particular. I think the design of this addition, I think the form, the window layout, the materials, I think it's a very unique and wonderful design. It'll be fun to see this one realized. I just wish that we weren't going to ever see any of it from the street.
Well, with apologies to the existing house, the words you used to describe it don't make it sound all that appealing. And I know it's better than...
No, it's a neat little building.
Oh, I know it's a neat little building, but if one took it out of context with those words, I'd say, well, let's fix that one too. But I know that's not the case, but I think this is a minimalist and handsome way to respect what's already there.
Difference of opinion,
Yes,
I think. Motion from someone?
I'll do it. Based on the analysis and findings listed in this staff report, staff recommends that the commission approve the application for a certificate of appropriateness for the new addition, the construction of the accessory building, replacement of the windows, and approve the special exception requests associated with these proposals with the following condition: that approval of details is delegated to staff.
Now, you read that staff recommends, but you're actually moving that we do this.
You're right. That is my motion.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? If not, should we start at the far left this time? Shall we?
Harding, nay.
Esther, yes.
Richardson, aye.
Victoria, aye.
Peters, aye.
Aye.
Hyde, aye.
The motion passes, obviously. Thank you very much. Thank you for a very nice, clear presentation, good drawings, perhaps beyond what you maybe wanted to produce and such, but very helpful for the analysis. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. Carl, you doing all of them tonight? So,
Yes, you bored you? We have something different for you now.
so we're into the work session now,
Yeah.
which we will.
This is the opening of a conversation, effectively, I think. This is a work session, so there is no recommendation attached to this particular staff memo. The commission will recall, those of you who were on the commission at that point in time, that we previously looked at a proposal questioning the contributing status of this particular building. The building in question is 287 G Street, which is part of the site with 480 6th Avenue. It's on the corner of 6th and G, obviously. And this proposal at the moment, in summary, involves retaining primarily 3 of the external facades of this cottage, and then linking that with new rear additions which would adjoin this particular building structure to the adjacent commercial. And we'll go into this in slightly greater detail so that you have a better understanding of it. But there's also the proposal to extend the existing, rebuild and extend the existing later garage structure at the southeast corner of the site and bring that forward part way along the south facade of this cottage. So that part of the exterior appearance of that would be lost. The proposal is to retain that internally. The rear and west facades of the cottage would be removed in this case. The proposal is to excavate the basement, rebuild the foundations, which apparently markedly needed in this context, with those new additions to the west and the southwest. And before you this evening, there are two options presented in terms of the process for achieving this. Quoting from the application at the moment, it says, located in the heart of Salt Lake City, this historic cottage house located in the avenues has been neglected for several years. The main goal of the project is to restore the building to its original charm and update the deteriorated property, retaining as much of the historical integrity as possible. Then we have prepared two proposals to accomplish these goals. These goals. The location, corner of 6th Avenue and G Street. An existing view of the cottage on the lower right, and an original 1930s view of the cottage above on the right. Briefly, in terms of the context of this contributing building, dates to approximately 1870, described as a vernacular cross-wing single dwelling in the 2007 survey, and is only one of 28 or so buildings from that earliest period left in the avenues, that period being 1860 to 79. That's about 1% of the total. As I mentioned previously, the Historic Landmark Commission reviewed a proposal to review the contributing status and downgrade the contributing status of this building in June 2016. The Commission actually confirmed the building's contributing status and its importance at that time. The intent at that point in time was, once it was defined as non-contributing, was to demolish the building. So there are references to the existing and previous reports in your the material before you. So we have, in summary, and I'll go into this in slightly greater detail in terms of the full package of drawings, but we've got two options as currently proposed. You can see in this diagram, bottom right, the rear walls of the cottage being removed, the existing three walls being braced, and the excavation and construction of an extended basement area. It has a partial basement area at the moment, and the rebuilding of the foundations in the context of that. Option 2 would actually cut the walls away from their footing. It's probably fair to say that in certain locations they aren't well attached to what footings we have here because of the effect of ground level moisture on the base of the walls, especially along the north side. It would deconstruct the three walls and move those aside, take off the roof obviously prior to that, excavating the basement and constructing the foundations on an open site, and then reconstruct the walls with primarily, I believe, a new roof, and then the new additions. Photographs of the existing commercial and the original cottage. Previously was 6th Avenue. This is the G Street view. You can see the garage structure to the south of the cottage building. That would be proposed to be demolished and brought forward and extended partway along the cottage south facade. View of the cottage from the northeast and the southeast, again showing the garage and the relationship with the building behind. The relationship as it exists with the existing commercial building, as far as you can see, going some way back to where physically they are slightly co-joined because there's an enclosed later porch, addition and doorway for the cottage, which we'll go into and see some photographs of in a moment. And that's that structure, actually, which has been added later, and that kind of links with the rear walls of the commercial building and with the rear walls of the cottage. That's existing structure. Interior shots, that's the same area internally. That's the garage wall you see in the photograph to the left, and the rear wall of the commercial building on the right of that photograph to the left, and then part of the cottage original walls on the right-hand photograph. This is an internal shot of the west facade, northern section of the west facade. That would be removed with these proposals and would be lost. This is the north facade viewed internally. This would be kept with either option, these proposals. A couple of additional internal views showing you part of the original wall structure dividing the cottage into two. It's thought that this cottage was the subject of an early addition, and what you're looking at there, I think, is part original and part later, but still very early. Excuse me. The view on the left-hand side is along the east facade, looking towards the south. Again, internal view primarily along the western walls. Those would be removed, as would that internal wall structure. And this is looking at the southwest corner. The wall on your right would be removed. The wall on your left would actually be retained, and that window would remain, but internally, these proposals. A couple of details of the roof structure, which seems to be interesting. Those of you who had a chance to see the interior will perhaps remember this. You can see some of the original roof boarding timbers through the joists there in that location, plus parts of the structure which still retain sections of bark on the wood as was originally cut. Going to the application drawings as they currently stand, showing the juxtaposition of the existing cottage, the linking porchway, which we mentioned earlier, to the commercial building to the immediate west. Option one, where the existing walls, three facades would be retained and braced. I think that the intention there is to retain the roof in the context of that as well. So what would be lost would be those rear walls, as depicted in diagram. The second option, as previously mentioned, again retains the three walls, but actually takes them away to actually excavate the site. So those walls would be cut from the foundations, then moved aside. The work carried out in the basement to excavate that and build new foundations. The walls would be moved back. I think most of the roof will be lost in this one, but the applicant might be able to speak to that in greater detail in terms of current intent. And again, the proposal with its new additions, linking that effectively with the commercial building, but not in terms of contiguous space. So you would lose part of the south facade of the building, where the garage would be rebuilt and extended forward, eastward. Basement as proposed in this current series of proposals. Roof plan and a detail of the excavation around the cottage to actually improve the drainage and the relative grading around the existing walls. And the current facades as proposed. This applies to both options, which would end up really achieving this overall relationship. So you'll see In the context of this, you can see the degree to which the cottage becomes linked with the adjacent commercial. You also see on the south facade the degree to which the extension of the garage structure would come forward of and enclose part of the south facade of the cottage. So, as identified by staff at this point for this work session, these work session purposes, there are several key considerations, and those are outlined in your staff report in greater detail. But effectively, the questions I have identified here in terms of a review of what's proposed. One would be, would either of the proposed options retain sufficient of the integrity of the historic building? And to an extent, these questions somewhat overlap. Is the phased approach presented here, either option, the most appropriate methodology for safeguarding and rehabilitating the building? 3, would the proposed additions retain sufficient of the historic building fabric, which is slightly different from the integrity? Would the proposed additions overwhelm the historic building? Is another question which immediately springs to mind. And finally, and kind of as an encapsulation of the other questions, is this an appropriate balance in the stewardship of this building? There may well be other questions that this raises, so that's not an exhaustive list, but I presented that in terms of launching discussion on this and to garner your thoughts and expertise in terms of this approach and acceptability, revisions, alternatives, thoughts on the balance really between retention, new addition, and the future survival of the cottage or parts of it. And I would conclude my presentation at that point. Very happy to answer any questions which immediately arise. I can just sort of sit in on the wings here. The applicant I know is here and will have something to say, I think, in relation to these proposals as well.
Any questions for Carl at this time? If not, please.
I have one
Oh,
question,
sorry, go ahead,
actually,
Sean.
and maybe you said it and I missed it.
Yeah.
But do you have a preference between the two options?
Well, I think coming at it with a preservation hat on, one's initially looking at the integrity of the building. So the more of that you can retain and work around, the more of the integrity of the building you hold on to in the context of an approach of this nature. So consequently, that would steer you towards option 1, which wouldn't take the walls away and then bring them back again and possibly lose aspects of the roof as well.
Yeah, I have a few questions, I think.
Yeah.
I thought I understood this, but now I'm not sure that I do. Do both proposals involve completely eliminating the roof?
I think the first proposal, the intention is to retain the roof. So one's working with a shored up series of 3 facades and roof structure and excavating within that.
Underneath the roof?
That's my current understanding of this proposal, and that's certainly been my understanding of some of the discussions with the applicants up to this point in time.
Okay. Another question. Would you mind going to the reconnaissance survey?
Sure. I don't have those sheets on this
Oh, you don't?
series. I've got the summary here in terms of the points, if that
I can just
suffices.
read. So this is the first time I've come across, at least that I can remember, the issue of a outbuilding and being demolished. And in the reconnaissance survey, there's a column that says out B, which I assume is outbuilding, and then N/C. And I'm guessing that means non-contributing, contributing.
Non-contributing, probably.
No, this is contributing.
Oh, they said NC.
Well, no, I think it's non-contributing / contributing, and 0 non-contributing, 1 contributing. Well, first of all, am I reading that right? Do you know?
I think
And I'm not sure what specifically that's referring to. I mean, is that going to be the garage itself?
That's my guess. I mean, I think that's the only outbuilding.
And that's, I mean, that is relatively early, but it's much later than the cottage. It's also, I don't know if it figures in these particular photographs, but the south facade wall, or the south wall of that, is actually leaning outward. So it's coming apart at the corner. So the idea really was, as part of this approach, to actually take those existing materials, retain and kind of rebuild that in its current footprint, but extend it forward and raise the height of it slightly.
Well, but in doing so, I mean, the whole original building would be subsumed.
As far as the garage is concerned, yes, it's
and
true.
Is that how does the new demolition ordinance for contributing structures apply to outbuildings or not?
Generally, no. Although I'm sure there would be occasions where we might consider an accessory building as being extremely important in the case of a carriage house, but usually it doesn't. Having said that, I mean, they're part of the historic fabric of any historic district. The frontage of the garage is at the moment, you've had a chance to look at it on site as well, rather looks like it's been fabricated from a series of salvaged sections of something else, probably several something else's. Now, what it was prior to that, or maybe that was the original form of it, I don't really know. I haven't got any further details of that. But it certainly, structurally speaking, it would need a few tiebacks if you were going to keep it in terms of those walls, which would be physically possible to do.
Nick, is that what? Do you want to add at all to the city's approach to demolition of contributing accessory buildings?
I think
we're really being arcane now. I'm just curious.
I think Carl's right. I think it generally they wouldn't necessarily be contributing, but we know that there are some accessory buildings that are very significant, whether they're on a landmark site or, I mean, some of the obvious examples are some of the large mansions on South Temple that have some pretty significant accessory structures. Generally, though, in a situation like this, I wouldn't imagine that most accessory buildings would be considered contributing.
Seems like I remember it's been maybe 4 years. I can see the garage. There was a replacement garage project, and since I can't place it, I don't even remember what the final result was. I think we ended up approving its replacement. There was a real garage door issue, access issue to it, and things like that, and I think we ended up approving it.
And there was a summer kitchen to the rear of it, which actually predated the garage, I think, didn't it? Which was perhaps more interesting than the garage itself, from recollection, yeah. And I think they retained that part from recollection.
Anything else?
Yeah, I have one more.
Sorry.
Are there any design standards or guidelines that require or suggest the protection of historic structural members? I don't think any do, but I just wanted to ask.
Well, I mean, I suppose going back to first principles, if one's talking about an historic building, then you start with the fabric of it, really, and the structure of the building, and you're talking about what actually holds up what you're seeing externally. So, and that has to be part of the definition of historic integrity, I think. So by implication, yes, I think it all kind of addresses that. Now, we don't generally address something in terms of the interior of the building as such, in terms of our role here, whether it's staff or as a commission. However, you are actually talking about a structure, a building itself, so you've got to actually sort of include aspects of that within the overall determination of what's important, I guess, would be my
I
thought.
think, I'm just flipping through the design standards that you've listed in the staff report. And number 6 talks about deteriorated architectural features, which we usually see from the street, rather considering the rotted 2x4 inside. But nevertheless, deteriorated architectural features shall be repaired rather than replaced where feasible. So I think that's kind of takes us down that path of retain the maximum amount of historic fabric rather than
Yeah.
a quick replacement decision. Okay. Why don't we have the applicant come forward? Let's make this less formal and bring your observations and your thoughts forward.
Mr. Chair, before you move on, can I just, I have a comment about that, about the interior stuff and
There's an exterior.
all that. I think it's important to rely on what our ordinance says in this.
Absolutely.
And it talks about when a certificate of appropriateness required, and it clearly says something that involves the exterior appearance of the structure of the site. So if something on the inside, it doesn't necessarily serve the public purpose of why we have the historic district when the public, it doesn't play a role in the public perception of the building. And so I think that's important to keep in mind.
Right.
Okay, so the obviously like insanely old subroof is not really our realm for.
Yeah, clearly there's some very interesting things in a lot of old buildings that when you go inside that you wouldn't see from the outside. But for the I think the purpose of our ordinance, it's talking about what's on the outside.
Certainly, certainly. And I think my only point would be such heavy changes to the inside that, how thin of historic skin have we maintained, I think is the issue a little bit, and whether we've maintained it or not. So could you all introduce yourselves, please? And since you see our names, we need to know yours a little bit, and that would help. So,
I'm Pamela, the owner of the property.
okay.
I bought it 2.5 years ago. The commercial building is part of the cottage. And that is also historic. That was built in 1914, I believe.
Okay.
And we successfully remodeled and upgraded the commercial building and have had nothing but positive input from the community. It's a working building. Everybody loves it, and we're trying to upgrade the cottage as best we can. When I bought it, it was a crack house, so it's been through some. I don't know if any of you have been in there, but it's barely standing. We want to keep it and preserve it, and we've worked 2.5 years to get to this point. I think we've had a lot of different concepts, and we're down to the final few.
I'm Max Engel. I'm with Domicile, the general contractor to be used on the project. We're currently working on the historical project Kitty Corner on 6th and G that was approved about 1.5 years ago. So we're looking at helping Pam out with this one right here, and looking forward to working in collaboration in conjunction with you guys to help preserve the historic nature of this great little cottage.
I'm Scott Moses. I'm one of the architects at Smith Hyatt, and just hoping to get this project going.
I'm Rodrigo with Smith Hyatt Architects, and I will start the presentation pretty quick. We'll make it quick. So we just brought a couple things. We brought a couple pictures that so the ones that were not able to go to the site visit can be aware of the situation of the building. So this is the building that Pamela was mentioning. It's all in the same property. this building and the cottage house. So they're very close to each other, as we could see. I think there's a better picture to show it later, but this is the conditions. This picture was taken a couple days ago. One of the biggest issues that we're finding right now is because this part here is pushing the wall. So right now there's no foundation or anything into the cottage house. So the only thing holding this wall here is the siding right now and gravity, apparently. So we're really lucky that it's still standing up, but that's a big issue. So the first thing that we would do, we kind of separate it into phases. And the first phase that we would do in this project is making this all the same level, so there's no ground pushing the building, and then we can reinforce the structure and everything else. But first step would be level this all up with this here, because there's a slight slope here that it's pushing the building, the gravity, the dirt. This is the garage view that we were talking about. This is the existing building, the basement access to the building. As we can see, people did work throughout time in the building. So this is our addition will go until here. So we're still maintaining the front of the building as much as possible as we can. We're reusing the siding as much as we can. We're preserving the roof in both the options. We're gonna disable the roof and then put it back together. We're gonna label them, but Max will explain that process a little better for us. Here's what I was talking about, how there's no structure attached to the walls. The walls are floating right now and the ground is pushing because there's like a couple trees and roots there that are pushing the building. This is what we're trying to get rid, because right now this is the only piece of retention wall built in there. So it just ends here and then here it goes all the way to the ground. So this is what we're trying to cut down and make the site all one. And then that was the detail that Carl showed us off the retention wall. So we're trying to build a retention wall closer to the sidewalk and retain that ground. This is the space between the two buildings. So there's like 2.5 feet between the salon and the cottage house. So it's a very small space between the two buildings. And that's why in our proposals, we're kind of making all one building. So the cottage house is part of the other building, but at the same time, it comes forward. So it brings the attention more to the cottage house. It brings the value and to the historical building. So this is our plans. This is the existing garage, which I don't know if we can call it a garage because you cannot even fit a car in there. It used to be a garage back in the day, I assume, but nowadays it's more of a workspace shed-ish. And then this is the tiny addition also that we're proposing to them. And this is the space between so this is like 2.5 feet. This is the trees, and then this is where we plan to put the retention wall, so the ground is not pushing against the building, and then we're making this all one same level here. Max can present the two options that we have, and then we can talk a little about it. So yeah.
So we're looking at two different options for restoring the structure. We're right now up against the big issue we have is we have the structure, the main floor structure is rotted out around the perimeter of the house. On the west side, the north side, completely rotted out. On the northeast side, about half of the structure is rotted. The house is built as would have been typical back then at the time as a balloon framed house. So the exterior walls were built and attached to whatever foundation was there. It looks like on the north side, on the west side, and on the northeast side, it was built wood to ground, no foundation. There is a small foundation on the south end. So the wall plates were set on the ground on the north side, set on the foundation on the south side. The floor joists then were run through into the walls and set on the sole plates, and that's how the floor was created. With now typical construction and new construction we would do, for new codes, we have to bring the foundation up 6 inches above the existing grade, so we'll have to alter the grade by lowering the grade on the north side and on the northeast side to allow the foundation to come up above the grade so it no longer will rot out. and then we'll put a new floor on top of the foundation, and then we would take the new walls, or the old walls, and we would cut the walls where they're rotten off or at the new floor level, put new plates on those walls, then reinforce the existing lumber that's in there. That's the lumber that's of question because of the integrity, to keep the integrity of the house, the lumber that looks like it was possibly milled on site or somewhere close to site because it has the bark on it. So we would reinforce that, and then we would rebuild the structure using the existing walls. We would like to, looking at the two options, the bracing option, and
Max,
then...
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Going back to the foundation, the reestablish a new foundation under whichever scheme this comes, do you still anticipate the siding, and I know that recognize that some of it's buried by dirt today, but basically the siding would extend down to the existing level that it is today?
It would come down to within 6 inches of the dirt line today. So we'd keep it, we have to keep it up 6 inches above so that doesn't rot.
Right, you're moving dirt down. I mean,
Correct.
You're moving grade down.
So we would have a little bit of exposed foundation, the bottom 6
Right.
inches.
But wood siding, the bottom piece of wood siding that ends up on that north elevation is where the wood siding was before it rotted away.
Correct. It'd be really close to that elevation line. So the challenge we have with the project is, and with both of these methods we're proposing, we'd like to maintain the original roof. The roof right now currently has 3 layers of asphalt shingles on it, so in order to be re-roofed, it has to be completely stripped down, which would mean we take it down to the current gap sheathing, which is the 1x8 sheathing that's on top of the 2x4 roof rafters. Then we would resheet it with new 1/2-inch OSB and put the new roof on top of it. But when we typically would shore up a house like this, in order to redo the foundation, we shore it up from the floor. So we would basically put beams underneath the floor, run those beams long out past the foundation, out past the dig, where the dig has to happen, and then we would lift the house up and dig underneath it and redo the foundation. The problem we have with this house is that the floor is so rotted out, there's nothing to lift off of on the floor. So effectively, in order to make a bracing option work, we'd have to lift it from the roof, which would mean we'd then have to run our structural beams through at the plate line, the roof plate line, and we'd have to suspend the walls off of the roof and lift up the walls and take out the floor, which would be really, really difficult to do. That's why we think that we can maintain the integrity of the home best by going with the second option, which would be to, since we already have to strip the roof down to the gap sheathing, we go ahead and label the gap sheathing, and then we label the roof members, the joists, the ridge beams, the hip rafters, dismantle them, keep them on site, and then clip the 3 walls that are left on the 2 corners, brace them, stack them off to the south side of the lot, then go ahead and dig in our new foundation, build our new floor, and then come back in, lay the walls back down on the new floor, and rehabilitate and restore the walls and re-stand them up, and then see, hopefully at that time we can save about 90% of the siding that's on the current walls. We would get new siding milled up that would match the existing siding, and that would have to be done from the plate line down. We'd have to do new siding. So that's the extent of what we're proposing to do, and it's going to be a little bit of a chore, but I think in the end we'll have a building that it'll last, number 1, it'll last another 150 years. Number 2, it'll meet current seismic codes. Number 3, it'll meet new and current energy codes. And then number 4 is it will maintain the existing look of the original house.
And then really quick, so what we're proposing in both options, just talking about the design a little, is preserving the building as much as we can and preserving exactly how it looks right now, and then just adding this, popping the garage a little up to the front and then making the storefront that kinds of talk with the next door building, so we can see that this building kind of braces the historical building, but the historical building is more towards the front. So this is all recessed, so it doesn't compete with the historical building, but the historical building has it's an up front and a front plan. So it's like here we can see like how this is, there's like a big difference here, and there's like a little courtyard in the side by the historical building. So, yeah, so we're creating this, and then we're recessing. This is where the historical building wall is, and then we're recessing the garage. Right now it's like here, so we're just adding a couple feet to the garage-ish.
Also, we would be dismantling the existing brick on the accessory structure, cleaning that up, saving it, then reusing it to rebuild the new front facade of the accessory structure.
So this brick that we're seeing here, it's actually a reused brick from the garage structure from the accessory building. And it has the avenues look, so we're not creating something completely different from what's there, but we're kind of bringing what we have, the newer addition remodel, into the cottage house, but at the same time preserving the cottage house exactly how it looks like, restoring the windows, restoring everything about it, so it's all closest to the original as possible, and keeping the character of the building.
And we feel like the end product as well, if we excavate on the north side and keep the height of that accessory structure, the garage bump out below the existing cottage roof height, that from the north side, from the east side, as you're traveling around that corner, whether you're driving or walking, that original cottage is what takes precedence and what stands out. It's also a lighter color, so it naturally pops in contrast to that darker structure, the salon. So we're trying to keep as much as possible and really let that cottage be the focus.
Okay, thank you very much. It's supposed to be a work session, so we need to just have some flow of questions and suggestions and observations, and I think, start somewhere.
So it seems to me that something that we need in order to discuss this is more information about how other cities do. Maybe you know how historic buildings are handled, and I don't. And so I think it would be helpful to know, are these good proposals? Is one preferable to another? I mean, I see the need for a new foundation, what they're doing, and common sense dictates a certain result, but I think we might need some input from other cities who have addressed this.
I think, that I have never been involved in one of the projects. I know that in Park City, they've done a few projects where they've actually taken, cut down the corners basically of a building and reestablished them. I can't speak to the end result. I know that it's happened, but I don't know what kind of result they've had over time. But I think it's a valid question. It has some challenges. I mean, when you, just kind of philosophically, if you drive down the street and there's no building there during that foundation time of the project, kind of, is it a historic building when the pieces go back, the elevation pieces go back on? And it's kind of a, it's a real question, I think.
I'm curious to know how other jurisdictions have handled it.
I'm not sure that it's a matter of how other jurisdictions handle it. It's more the practicalities of how to accomplish the rebuilding. I'm not sure
Some might say, yeah, it's more expensive to do it this way, but this is really the only way you can handle a historic remodel or rehabilitation. Otherwise, it's just like new construction. I think that information might be helpful.
Is the Secretary of Interior silent on whether a building, whether this is still a historic building?
The current
if we
secretary?
take it apart and put it back together?
Well, it sort of is. We went, previous discussions a couple of years ago was that this body decided that this building was still a contributing building in its current status.
But would it be a contributing building if it were to be disassembled and reassembled?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question.
I don't have facts.
What does the National Park Service tell us there?
That's a good question. My answer wouldn't be based on facts, but I think it would still be considered historical. We're doing the practical.
Here comes Carl.
Way of
Carl
approaching this. Please, Carl.
Go ahead, Ken. No, I was just going to say I was re-referencing some of our previous discussion material in your memo, and in fact, because we were looking at the contributing status of the building previously, there was a lot of National Park Service methodology and reasoning attached to that. Some of that I repeated here, and some of it is indirectly referenced in terms of those live links to that previous report. So there is a fair bit that they say about, you know, sort of how you retain contributing status, what is integrity, various things of that nature. So
do you know, for example, if it's taken apart and set aside and then put back together, if it would still be contributing?
That's difficult to reach a rapid conclusion on, I think.
Yeah.
That eventually.
It's a good question. I'm not trying to deny that it's relevant, but let's look at this another way. What if we weren't having this work session? What if the applicant had come before us saying, this is the design we're proposing, and the method of accomplishing that wasn't even addressed? We haven't asked other applicants who are restoring buildings how they're going to do it. Are you going to support it and underpin the foundations and rebuild them, or are you going to hook a sky hook to the top and lift it up? We're just looking at the final result. How does this differ?
I've run into this before. I don't think we've run into this precise issue of having to put in a whole new foundation. I mean, that's huge. I've never seen it before. So I think it just raises some new issues.
That's a good question. I've seen them, but not historically. There are two of them up on the east bench that are going right now where they've had enough structural integrity in the house where they could dig out under the foundation in like 10 or 12 foot pieces, jack it, hold it up in with jacks or whatever and build in. But as part of their building permit process, well, they did have to provide structural analysis for how that was going to be accomplished safely.
I would agree with you. And typically we've done that as well before, where if there's enough structural integrity in an exterior wall, we can go ahead and we can shore up sections of the wall and we can pour a new foundation pieces at a time and maintain the structural integrity. But this one's a little bit different because there is no foundation period. So there's nothing to support there's nothing to support the walls off of. I have seen when I was in Williamsburg, Virginia, at historical Williamsburg, that they did take down they were dismantling and restoring some of the exterior, like some of the cabins, those original log cabins. The logs had deteriorated to the point where they're no longer usable, so they had to replace them, so they had dismantled them, and then they had rebuilt them. I don't know if that's in the report that Carl's referencing from the National Park Service, because I'd assume that is a National Park Service site. So, also, you know, where I got the idea for doing this from was watching the historic redo that they did on the Alpha Graphics building on State Street in 300 South, where they completely removed the entirety of the building and left the entire facade.
That's facadism.
That's facadism, exactly. So, yeah,
Facadectomy.
So we talked because we were looking at doing that as well, was possibly leaving maybe two-side facade up and then trying to repair it in that way. But really, there's still not enough to shore off of to help brace the building.
But you're presenting two options. I mean, one is I think we all recognize the ease, perhaps. I'll say ease. It's not going to be easy of dismantling the building. I mean, it's sort of a straightforward thing. Supporting it is challenging, but you feel you could.
We
enough plywood and enough big beams, you can hold that in place.
Yes, and then that becomes problematic as well, because now we have, as we hang the walls off of the roof, the amount of bracing that we have to do to the exterior walls means we're sending all kinds of fasteners through the walls, through the exterior siding, so we're going to be damaging the siding and the structural members by penetrating them and bracing them off. It's kind of looking at it, if you're asking me, probably cost-wise, it's going to be close to sixes. But from a standpoint of a professional, what's going to be the best for the overall longevity of the building? I think that option number 2 is the best, which is cutting the walls, taking the 3 segments off, storing those walls, and then redoing the foundation and the floor, and then putting the walls back on top, and then rebuilding the roof with the original roof members and the original gap sheathing.
On the roof, though, you're going to have to be augmenting all of the structure in any case, aren't you? I mean,
That would be up to the building department, because if we're dismantling it, obviously it's 2x4 roof joist structure. 2x4s are not allowable by code any longer, and once we take it apart, if we're gonna have to put it back together and then sister on new roofing members to it alongside them, I'm not sure what the building department's gonna require of us at that point.
yeah, I think we can all imagine, though.
Nick had a reference earlier to Paul's question about historical interior structure and supporting things. And Nick referenced something that said the ordinance talks about the external appearance. And if we get the same external appearance and the return of the historical form, why does it matter what steps we take to get there?
Well, I think, Kenton, I think the things that are going to happen, even with the utmost care, I think in the dismantling of walls, you're likely to lose all of the fascia. I mean, that's going to have to come off. And so you'll have new material up there. I think when we're done, if we go the dismantling route, is that you'll have sections, you'll have 3 partial wall planes that have original siding on them, and we're going to have new siding in any case, in both cases, integrated. I think there's going to be more retention of the original materials, which again, we're supposed to retain and repair wherever possible rather than just replace. And I think it's just a given. I think once you start taking it apart, more pieces will be lost in that. I appreciate that you're going to be shooting a lot of holes through the existing stuff, and maybe you'll come up with great ways of reinforcing the window openings and doing a lot there, but I recognize there's a lot of holes that will go through this building in keeping it.
Well,
the other thing too that becomes that makes option number 1 a little more difficult is that normally you'd have 4 sides to be able to shore off of, and on this circumstance you only have 3 because the adjacent structure to the west is right on the property line. There's no real place to be able to shore back from. We'd have to shore off that building, which could become problematic.
Yeah, I think there's obviously some real gymnastics, I think, that are going to be needed to make it fly.
Well, the bubble over the Liberty Park tennis courts currently isn't being used. Maybe you could just inflate it on the inside and lift it up.
Or happy to work with the city and do something like that. Yeah.
You mentioned property line. Are these 2 different lots? I mean, that's really not historical. It's also
but it's a structure, so that structure is going to be staying. So.
And then just one more comment that I was thinking. It's interesting because historical buildings, no matter where you go, they're going to be different. Since we have to see a lot about the site also. Since this site is so tiny and small, the work area there, that's what makes option 1 also a little bit harder, because there's not a whole lot of room in the site to brace and then lift and do those things, because such a small property there, and then we already have this building which is there that we don't want to touch at it because it's already a restored building, so we don't want to mess with that building. So it just leaves us with not too much room to work around, and that's why we think that the second option, it's a better option in our point of view as the architect, the construction, and the owner. That's why we feel like the second option is a little better, and the final result is basically the same. It's just a matter of which one's going to cost. Cost-wise, actually, I think it's going to be pretty close, but which one it's going to be easier to preserve as much as we can, and that's why we think that moving those to the side might be easier to preserve, if not all the walls as they are right now. So
let me, I think, and I guess you're going to go away and make some decisions in what way you're going to approach the application. I think Carl had five points, and I don't need them pulled up right now, but I think another one that's important, especially while we're looking at it here, if we can toggle between, though if you can back us up and toggle us between the existing plan and the proposed plan, because I think the extent, for me another issue is the extent of how the new additions embrace, engulf, move alongside, however, whatever you want to describe the existing building. And I think because of the existing building, if I'm not mistaken, we see the full south elevation and the corner returns, and that's still outside. It's a nasty space, and it's a nasty addition in there between there. But you see the full south elevation. Is that correct? And in the proposal, that garage rebuild moves quite a ways on that south elevation, and I find that a little bit concerning. There's that's the south corner, southwest corner.
And there's like a window that it's closed right now there.
Correct.
Yeah, so it's this, and what we're proposing is basically keeping this line here, but since here, so you're seeing more than half of the building here, so we're just moving this garage towards here-ish.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the challenge I have, is that at some point we've sort of just engulfed the building in the new construction. I appreciate on the other side, on both sides, you've got a recess from the new addition is recessed from the face of the building, but at some point this gets to be like the old Amazon jewelry, used to be, which was just the stone glued back on the building. And I think that's an issue that we need to avoid. I mean, if we go through all this gymnastics and the end result is that people say it doesn't feel like a historic building, and they walk into it, and I know that we're not interiors, but they say I'm not experiencing a historic building anymore. We've kind of gone through a lot of work for not the end result that you're necessarily after, I think, or that we're after. Can you discuss why you need to engulf that south elevation as much as you have? And I know engulfing is a pejorative, but
it's also because I think it's also we're making the building a little bigger, and size is a lot, but at the same time we're still keeping the historical building, as much as we can as like the main piece off the property. And that's why I understand where you come from, but at the same time there's not much to be seen on that side. We're preserving like the front facade and then the G6th Avenue, so it's like, I don't know.
I think that the primary, I've been working a lot for Kitty Corner right across the street on the project across the street. The thing that I think you see the most, the predominant facades of the house are obviously on 6th Avenue and G Street, and I think that this accessory building, it's a small accessory building. I think that the intent is to pull it forward as much as we can without making the building feel like it's now subservient to the rest of the building. And I think that we could play with that if that became an issue, but I think it could go back a foot or two more. But I think that the key thing is in the materials that are used on the cottage, the coloring that's used on the cottage, so that you don't lose that building. I mean, you've seen all these buildings along State Street. When you go down there, you see a store has been built around it. You can kind of see an old structure back in behind there, and it looks terrible. But we want to make this look like it would be. It could have been built that way from the beginning.
And then also the materials that we're using in this new addition that we're pulling forward, it's a lot of glass. So it's like, it gives you kind of the light-ish. It's not like we're building a big brick wall there against the building, but it's something that complements the building and goes well with the next door building on the same property. So it talks with the purple building right now.
I don't know.
Well, I think my feeling on the massing of the new construction and its relation to the historic building is that I think it's fine. It's pulled back enough that I think you're still going to read this as a historic little house. And if where the garage is comes forward 4 feet or 6 feet or whatever it's proposed to be, I don't think that's gonna.
I think it's closer to 10.
Do much. All right. Well, even 10. And the same for the little gap between the commercial building and the house. I just don't think that's a big change.
I think that one's pretty successful on the north side.
I think I want to go back just endorse what Kenton said. I'm really nervous about the Historic Landmark Commission picking a construction method. I think that's a recipe for all sorts of problems. I think it's far beyond our realm of expertise. I don't think it's supported by the ordinance. And I think Kenton's exactly right that our job is to judge the exterior, and moving forward, I would suggest you come forward with a plan for the exterior, and we'll give you a yay or nay, but based on the standards. But good Lord, I don't want to tell you how to take a house down.
Yeah, Paul, while I appreciate your affirmation there, I do think that we, as Shelley pointed out, we aren't the first ones to encounter this situation. It would be interesting to know how the Park Service or how a Park City or something has dealt with the mechanics of actually doing this.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it should make us tell the applicant how to do it, but it would be helpful to have some background on how these things are addressed by the Park Service and by agencies or organizations that have encountered this before. Give us a little bit more understanding of how to make our decisions.
I'd be really interested in seeing that, but I think I would suggest that we separate that inquiry from this application, because it's...
Oh, I'm totally with you there. I mean, we're the Historic Landmarks Commission. We're not the Historic Construction Commission. It's not our job to dictate how a job gets done. It's our job to dictate what the end product looks like. And that's what we rule on. So, we should be, instead of talking about how this happens, we should be talking about, what happens to the historic windows? What about the door? What are the roof materials? How will this project be detailed?
I think those are,
And how we get there, whether we end up with a Disneyland project or not, doesn't really fall under our auspices.
I think, but I agree, David, the details, we can't spend all our time talking about the back corner and not talk about the windows kind of thing. At the same time, I think we are talking about the degree of preservation of the historic material. And there are different means, and I think maybe we obviously leave it to the applicant to go away, to look at these drawings, look at the buildings and say, okay, we think we're going to be able to maintain this portion of it and that portion. These elements are going to be new. Talk to the building department, because I think while you may be able to put 2x4s back up in that roof structure, I think they're going to be decorative. I think you're going to have a whole new roof structure, which I think you'd have anyways, but you'd at least be sistering them on. Anyways, and I think then we see what
But I
left
think
they've got.
where it does apply to us is that it might be a de facto demolition. There might actually be one when they take it all apart. And demolition is definitely our purview.
Right, and I think that defines, there's some there somewhere, if 3 walls are standing or something like that,
But there's
it's
a
a
proposal
remodel.
that they're all coming
But if you
down.
take the walls down and put them back up, that's a demolition. That's new construction.
So I think that's where it does apply to us.
Yeah.
What do you think, Paul?
Nick,
You're talking pretty lawyerly here. We got to get Paul.
Nick, is the 3 walls that's remaining, it's a remodel? And so your 2 different proposals, one's a remodel, the other's new construction using old materials.
Yeah, I think that's a synopsis right there. I think that is
That
the
may be
correct
the answer to your
synopsis.
question.
And I think that's what we need to sort of be concerned about. I mean, the commission decided this was a contributing building. Are we,
Nick, that might be in the building, the IBC.
are we giving a blessing now to disassemble and to make it a new building with some historic materials on it? I think that's an interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting conundrum. We ought to talk about doors and windows, and they're proposing a front porch. I think I saw, which I don't think I've seen in any historic photos. Does it show in the Sanborn maps or anything?
I think it shows in a tax photo.
At one point there was a porch there, and there's still not parts of it, but marks. You can see marked on the wall where the porch used to be back in the day, but I think that was an addition also on the early 19s maybe.
Did it ever show up in the Sanborns, Carl, do you know?
I'll
Up front
just look
porch?
at it.
I mean, that one's a little challenging because we have two nice photos from whatever, 36 and 1979. Neither of them have a porch. And those kind of cover the semi-historic periods of this house.
Well, you should go look at it. It looks like there was a porch.
There may very well have been. It's not on the Sanborn maps.
But we can definitely cut the porch out of the building.
If you want a porch, put it in and we'll talk about it again.
Yeah. What other topics? And Carl, maybe, Rodrigo, do you mind going back to Carl's, or just, no, you can do it. You run it.
Okay.
Just take us back to Carl's 5 questions.
Oh, okay. The end of. Oops, there you go.
Yeah, we don't have, we touched on all of those, and we don't have a definitive answer for any of them.
Yeah.
Well, no, 3 we left open for debate.
Well,
that's the engulfment issue.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So
How do
where do we leave them?
I don't know.
Am I right that this project's going to require?
Well, or we could just leave it like it is. It's an eyesore, and we're trying to do something nice.
Well, we definitely want you to do something nice. We appreciate your efforts, that you're all sitting here in front of us
We're
trying
ready
to come to a solution.
and willing, and we've been trying for 2.5 years, so it's frustrating.
This project's going to require a rezone, right?
That I don't know.
It is. What
I
would
don't know.
suggest that
I don't know how it's currently zoned because it's 2 properties on one.
It's
with two different uses on one lot.
Nick.
He may be up somewhere else.
I think I would move that we just table it and let these guys digest what we've said. I think this is a really tough project to move forward anyway. Yeah. So,
Nick, did you want to weigh in on the
Trying to.
on the buildings, the separate buildings, different uses,
separate.
all that's
They're
topic or not?
so the property zoned SR1A, so it doesn't allow commercial uses. So the commercial buildings considered not just a non-conforming use, but a non-complying building. So they're allowed to stay, be maintained. They can be expanded up to 25% of the footprint of the building. It's not unusual for us to have 2 separate buildings with 2 different uses on a single lot, because that's it's happened over time. And so it's not really an issue. The issue that may come up is if that single-family dwelling were ever proposed to be used as a commercial use.
and that's what this is.
And that's where we might be running into, we would probably have to make an interpretation as to whether or not that is the level of expansion of a non-conforming use, or if they have to go through as rezoning of the property.
Okay.
So we'll have to look at that. It'll be triggered by that square footage percentage of expansion, because my understanding is the buildings would be connected to some degree.
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, you know,
You're saying it's 25%?
It's 25% of the footprint of the, I think it's the footprint of the commercial building, but can't exceed 1,000 square feet. I think it's whatever's less. But we'll make sure that we clarify that language for you.
sounds-
so you know.
sounds-
You know, if this stays residential and it's a rental unit, there's huge tax credits available. You get 40% of the project back.
Right.
Have you explored that? 40% of your cost back.
No, not yet. We're just trying to
If you
get,
spend $100,000, you get $40,000 in tax credits.
we're just
But
trying
it would
to
have to
get
stay residential.
approval on what we're allowed to do.
Right. Well, this is the tax credits
They're
are,
irrelevant to what we're talking about here, but it's...
yeah, the tax credits are
yeah.
a separate process. They're
Just something
accessed
to
through the
think
State
about.
Preservation Office, but I'd really encourage you to start exploring that. I mean, because they are all things, you know, the zoning issue that Nick's discussed, the potential of tax credits, the factors that we've mentioned here, they all need to kind of come together to help you make that final decision as to how you're going to move forward, how you're going to propose to move forward. And so I think they're major parts. I don't know if there are other questions that you have for us that we haven't confused you yet on tonight, and that we can offer some ideas. I know that we've given you nothing very definitive, but I think we've identified a lot of issues that will give you thought. I think pause for thought on how much to retain and how to approach it. I don't know, are there other things that we can do for you?
I'm just a little confused how to proceed then. So let's say we table the project for now because there's so many questions around the project, right? But we're proposing to preserve as much as we can of the project. So how do we proceed if we do decide to table this project? Is it going to take another 2 years?
Well, we're not tabling anything because this is only a work session.
Okay.
So your next step is to finalize an application working with Carl. I think one question you need to answer in finalizing that application is the zoning issue, the reuse and the zoning issue. I think that's critical because
well, they can proceed, because if they want to proceed with the intention of it, at least for this segment of it being a residential structure, that's fine.
Right.
And then if they over time want to change it, then we deal with that.
I'd suggest exploring it.
Because as far as I understood, that's up to the planning commission, right? So it's like the historical would determine if it's okay to proceed with the project, not caring about what the use of the building is right now, right?
Correct.
So if we do decide to go with residential, but keep the same look of the exterior, we could.
You could turn around tomorrow and finalize your application with Carl and submit it.
I see.
I'm just suggesting the zoning is a due diligence thing. I think the tax credits that David brought up, which have certain ramifications in certain applications, and they're not onerous or expensive, is a potential 40% benefit to you. And so I think I would suggest that's a pretty important thing to consider.
Definitely.
You don't have to.
And that in turn will dictate the process which you go through to restore this.
Yeah, I think in terms of the process, perhaps working with Carl, looking at some precedents in other historical examples that might support one or the other of your approaches to redoing this. If you can do some research, or if Carl and staff can do some research to say, National Park Service in such situations has done this and this and this, then you have ammunition that can say this is not a tear down, rebuild, it's a remodel, or a renovation. That the issue that we left with just question marks, but might give you.
So can we use Park City as an example? Because
talk to
we
their
do them in Old
historical.
Town all the time.
That's a good example. I'm sure through Colorado.
That will help a lot.
Mining towns there. Our ordinances come from Department of the Interior.
They will have addressed it in lots of places.
Yeah.
But I think your mining town scenario is what's right. I mean, there's a tight little site, a tight little frame building built on the dirt. Those are all mining town sort of characteristics, and so I think the Colorado thought is there, and things like that.
Yeah.
So
come in with some basis to support your preferred approach to this.
Yeah. I mean, I wish that it was.
No,
I mean, you came with two proposals. You knew it was a challenge to how to address this, and you found that it's a challenge for all of us to know how to address it. And so, there's just kind of not an obvious yes or no on a lot of these things. To deal
as you presented it, or just reading through it before you started your presentation, they said, well, approach one is the no-brainer. You just brace things up and dig under. But then as you presented it further, the complexity presents itself. And I can see the issues at hand, but we can't tell you one way or another. But if you can tell us why you're going to do your preferred one, then we're more likely to get convinced.
And I think the issue is how it comes back. I mean, what's the end result? It is the end result. how much of these elevations, how much of these historic elevations that we see today will be seen tomorrow.
Well, yeah.
And the amount of material that you think you'll be, exterior surface material that you think you'll be hanging on to. Those are.
Flip to the 1936 County Archive photo. It's page 18.
I think we have it here.
Got it. She could hold it up.
Sure. I think it's
In my personal opinion, if you came back to us with a proposal that looked like that and had additions that we didn't see, it's a slam dunk.
Agree.
And as these guys
We
said,
don't care how you build it.
That's pretty much what it is.
We'll just make a rendering with that image and the addition
as,
and make it realistic and
Right, and note it up and show in your drawings, makes,
exactly.
yeah.
well, and as David and Charles said,
Restore the windows, restore
address
the door,
the
all that.
windows, the doors, the trim details. How are you going to address what you can preserve and what you can't?
I just want to add that I definitely want to commend all of you for even being willing to restore the building. I know it's difficult, and you, with whichever plan you are going to take, is going to be difficult. But either way, it's nice that you're willing to restore it to what it was and make it work for you right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we'll all second
Thank
that
you.
one. Work with Carl, keep working with Carl, and we look forward to seeing you here soon.
Thank you, guys.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Awesome.
Nick, I think the floor is now yours.
We're actually going to have one of our staff people, David Geldner, talk about this. I just wanted to quickly kind of give a little bit of insight onto why we're bringing this to the Planning Commission. Historic Landmarks Commission. The city currently has an adaptive reuse ordinance that only applies to landmark sites. And one of the things that we've been exploring is the role of an adaptive reuse ordinance based on some results we've seen in other cities in various scales, from small little mining towns to LA, and the benefits that they've been able to use that type of ordinance to achieve not just preservation goals, but also sustainability goals and some housing goals and things like that. And so we've been exploring the idea of adopting a similar ordinance to that. And so we wanted to give you guys an overview of what that is, how they've been used, so you can start thinking about that. We're very early in the process. We haven't actually started writing any kind of ordinance yet. We're doing our research on it. We have some shifting priorities in our division from the mayor's office and city council, so that obviously impacts our workload and our ability and timing of these types of things. But we wanted to introduce this so you guys can start, like I said, thinking and giving us some direction. We will be clearly back to the Landmarks Commission for this, but one of the big goals of this is that how can we, absent local historic designation, how can we also help preserve some of our more historic buildings that may not be locally designated or in a local historic district, but allow them to be a reuse. And so we're going to go over that, and I'm going to turn the time over to David.
Okay, I think Nick gave a very good comprehensive introduction on that. So as I said, we're in the very formative stages, preliminary stages of this. And since I haven't been to this body in quite some time, I'm David Gellner. I'm one of the planning staff members. So adaptive reuse zoning ordinance, again, very simply, process of taking an existing building and reusing it for a purpose other than for what it was originally designed. We have a number of good examples in Salt Lake City already where this has been done. This is the old Primary Children's Hospital on 400 East Capitol Park Boulevard. It's now a residential use. The Porcupine Restaurant, it was a fire station. This is on 13th East. It was a landmark site in the commercial zone, and so in a lot of ways that zoning promoted a change of use to a commercial use, and this is an adaptation of that fire station. More recently, we have Fisher Brewing on 800 South. they actually went through a process with the RDA. The RDA has low-interest loan money to promote adaptive reuse, particularly in the for the Granary District. And so they have their adaptive use program and encourages the reuse of those warehouses and historical buildings, or historical buildings, not in the sense of landmark, but that have historically been there. This is the Salt Lake Acting Company building where Saturday's Voyeur takes place. This is on 500 North, 200 West. Again, an old ward house that's been converted to a playhouse theater use. And so staff's looking at the development of a citywide ordinance for that kind of adaptive reuse of buildings. And as Nick had mentioned, it would promote city goals through the reuse of buildings rather than demolition. And again, when we look at the goals for historic preservation, housing, sustainability, economic development, a lot of those things can be bolstered by that adaptive reuse of existing buildings. Again, adaptive reuse basics is probably very basic, but when a building's no longer viable for the current or original use, it may be a viable option to change that use. Enables that neglected building be saved or reused for a needed purpose. Housing may be an example. A lot of tie-ins to historic preservation as well, and again, can involve properties that are not of great historical or architectural significance, but help form that urban fabric of the city and the neighborhood. So, advantages: enables growth in established locations where the infrastructure already exists, decreases that demand and need for new materials, and may draw less opposition than new construction because the form is already part of that neighborhood urban fabric. People are used to the form, so in a lot of ways just the function of the building is changing. Looking at existing city policy documents, Plan Salt Lake, Growing Salt Lake City, our housing plan, Sustainable Salt Lake, and the Community Preservation Plan all have different sections that hint towards or talk about adaptive reuse, whether it's in the context of infill, neighborhood stability and character, preserving those items, growing responsibly, increasing housing options, reducing parking, providing affordable housing, and again, aiming for a lot of different housing types and diversity in the housing market or different uses to kind of help bolster that urban fabric. So there is a lot of policy support already in our existing documents. And some of the zoning modifications, and this is things we're looking at in our research, how other cities and areas have dealt with some of these issues. Often when the buildings, when you're dealing with an older building, they were built at a time when the zoning ordinance requirements were much different in terms of parking, maybe the glazing ratios, what we have for entry door placement, and landscaping requirements. And often some kind of relief needs to be recognized from those regulations in order to make that reuse feasible. So we decided to look into, just within our own city, we have a number of buildings, some that have been reused, some that are opportunities waiting to happen that could possibly benefit from some kind of adaptive reuse ordinance. This is the old St. Mark's Hospital. It's zoned business park, so when it was reused, it precluded residential or commercial uses from taking place in that building, so it's used as office space. But again, this could have been, under an adaptive reuse scenario, been reused for some kind of housing use. It's another building. This is a warehouse. It was a telegraph building at 847 South, 800 East. This is kind of an oblique view. It's hard to get a street view of this building. The trees are so lush in front. And I've got a further photo from the back. And This is owned by Micah Peters. He is actually working on a planned development application for some kind of reuse of this building. It is zoned RMF 45, so it's in a residential multifamily zone. It is an existing building that could possibly be repurposed for multifamily development, but given the site itself, it would have to we would have to look at some zoning relief, or under an adaptive reuse scenario, you could look at some zoning relief for, again, where the entrance is placed, maybe landscape requirements, maybe some non-conforming aspects to the building in terms of where it sits on the lot, et cetera. This is another warehouse, and this one's located on 700 South, 404 West. It's a rather large building. It's in the CG, or General Commercial Zoning District. One of the things that it lacks is sufficient on-site parking, so as a result, it's hard to reuse the building for a lot of different purposes, and it sits mostly vacant. But again, that's where maybe under an adaptive reuse ordinance scenario, there could be some relief to those parking standards. It's also another one. This is a ward house. This is at 1102 West, 400 North. So it's zoned R1 7000, but it's a landmark site, so it would be big enough for adaptive reuse of a landmark site under our current ordinance provisions. But the uses are very limited, and there's a lot of standards it has to meet. So this possibly, again, if we were to be able to allow density or some other things to be considered, this building might have a lot more viable uses in a reuse scenario. And the Fisher Mansion, this one is zoned institutional. And again, conversion of it really wouldn't allow it to be used for commercial or residential or mixed use purposes because of the institutional zoning, but it would be a tremendous opportunity of a building that maybe could be reused under an adaptive reuse scenario. So we've conducted some staff research, quite a bit of it, as Nick said. We've been going through this, looking at what do other jurisdictions do, and a lot of cities have adaptive reuse ordinances or policies. They are looking into this as a growing trend, and different programs and methodologies, but similar end goals, again, to preserving that urban fabric and finding new uses for old buildings. Los Angeles has a very comprehensive program. They target specific areas of the city, a lot of conversion of old commercial buildings to living space, very successful historic preservation tool, waives density requirements, and many non-conforming aspects of the building are allowed to stay. Santa Ana, California has a similar program. They do include a building age requirement that the building has to be, I believe, built before 1974 to be eligible for adaptive reuse. Again, existing non-conforming aspects can remain. There are parking concessions, and alternative building standards are allowed between fire and building code if they provide a reasonable measure of life safety. Nashville has some residential development focus. They have specific restrictions for location as far as being on an arterial that has transit available, and a certain percentage of buildings must be converted to residential use. Portland allows some parking exceptions and some exceptions to other development standards, such as their bicycle accessibility and some other things. What would we include in a Salt Lake City ordinance? Well, we would be considering and looking, and this is what we're looking for input on, the criteria for eligibility, what would be, whether it's building age, certain historical aspects of it. Again, kind of wide open question. And we have been looking at the support and barriers in the current process. We know that building codes and fire codes and things like that, as well as those zoning ordinance regulations, can be a significant barrier to reuse. And again, process and approval mechanisms. Some cities use kind of an administrative approach. Others have a public input type of process. whether it's going through a special exception, through a public hearing body. And again, looking at that range of incentives to include whether it's parking reductions, allowing additional density, being able to waive landscape requirements, or things like that. Again, wanted to leave it open for questions and discussion, and this was just sort of a little bit of a fact-finding, getting an initial discussion started with this body.
I'll weigh in right away. I think that this is could be a fabulous tool to incentivize preservation. And it seems like you're exploring a lot of different ways to do that. Increased density, less parking, yada, yada, yada. Particularly, my ears perked up when you talked about Santa Ana and their building code flexibility. I think that could really incentivize development and preservation as well. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
So, like 97% of America, I went to grad school in Boston. So, like, this kind of stuff feels like really logical if we're going to continue to grow at a rapid pace. Salt Lake City has a woeful public transit infrastructure. And I live on the west side, so I don't have to deal with the avenue's congestion when it comes to parking my car. And I would really hate to see my west side become like that. So if any development of this could be in conjunction and as a means to maybe incentivize better public transit structures, I would really appreciate that.
And I don't know why it would have to be limited by age. It seems like any building where they're thinking that it could have a better reuse. I mean, saying that it has to be older than 73 or whatever, I think seems sort of arbitrary.
There's a lot of embodied energy there, yeah, in any building.
And that was, as we looked at different cities, some cities seem to have a arbitrary age. Others are just saying if it's an existing building that still has some viability and life left in it, it doesn't matter. It's part of the already existing fabric.
David, did they, in your research of other cities, do any of them have sort of a scale, a sliding scale, essentially? You know, you have a 15-year-old building that maybe is no longer suitable for its original use and would benefit from this, versus a 100-year-old building that does or doesn't have architectural significance. You could kind of have other categories. Is there anything like that the more points you get for having a really superb building in some ways, you get more incentives somehow? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, I think there are. I think actually LA does something very similar to that, whereas if the value of the building, meaning from a historic perspective, allows more flexibility in what you can and can't modify as far as a zoning standard. Whereas if it's, you know, a marginal building, maybe it's only 25 years old and it was an old big box store that's now vacant, they don't allow as many.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the example.
You're getting
pretty good example.
Getting pretty subjective in that, though. You know, you might have to bring it before some sort of board, and you know how unpredictable they can be.
And that, yeah, and that's that's obviously the process that we would try to identify what's going to work best for our city.
Yeah.
I'd agree with what Dave said, though, about some flexibility in codes, and then I'd add in, I don't know how you'd approach the ADA, because that's not a code, that's a legal thing, but that can be an impediment to financially feasible redevelopment as well. So somehow that might need to be addressed. And then if you can get the fire people and the traffic engineering and all those guys who generally are sticklers for their rules and regulations, you know, got to throw that all in.
It sounds to me like you guys have really already found the sore spots. But just to give some additional reinforcement, the first time I met Nick Norris was in an adaptive reuse of a building of my own where I asked for a variance for parking, which Nick opposed. But I am not holding a grudge at all. I moved past it last year.
I also helped him get his house remodeled.
10 years ago. That's true. Good point.
It's not just fire that's a stickler for codes.
The issue of parking with these and the current change of use ordinance in the parking ordinance is, first of all, it's absolutely incomprehensible. No ordinary human can read it. I think Ken Brown is the only person who knows what it means on the earth.
He's retiring, sadly.
And it's just too damn rigorous. You know, if you have an adaptive reuse of a project that has 3 parking spots, I think most of the proposed reuses are going to make sense regardless of the number of spots. And I would lean toward letting the market regulate that more than the zoning code. You know, people aren't going to make that adjustment if the parking's not going to work for the proposed use. So that's a huge one. Also, you know, like one of our overlay districts, the South State Street corridor, has these glazing requirements that pop up with existing buildings that really don't make sense to change the glazing. And it looks like you've got that on your list of things to maybe add some flexibility with. And then the last thing I was going to say is that I think you're totally right that no matter what you do on the kind of zoning and planning front, if there isn't some additional flexibility on the building code side, it's really going to be hard to have an impact that filters through. So, you know, what Dave and others have said, if there's some degree of accommodation, we want these adapted buildings to be safe for their intended use, of course, but it feels like in some cases the proposed remediation is so draconian that it basically makes good projects impossible. And if there's a way to avoid that, I think that'd be great.
Okay, thank you, that's very helpful.
Just a comment on the building code. I think we recognize the barriers that exist there, and within the code there are some exceptions for historic buildings and things like that. So hopefully we'll be able to go down that avenue. If we can't, then the really difficult part about that is that we'd have to get the state legislature to allow us to make modifications to building code. I will say, I don't think that we're opposed. I mean, we are going to try to do that. I know that for a fact, but that we don't control it, right? So we'll see how that shakes out.
I think it's a great idea, what you guys have going on, but also if you want a property to start, you can start with the Fisher Mansion. That's a very special one to me, and I don't see it having any issues with parking. There's plenty of space out there, and it could really use some work. And I think they just opened the bike route near it.
Correct.
So it'll automatically bring, I'm just proposing that. But
Yeah. So I think there are actually kind of a lot of points that could be scored on properties that, you know, Kent, you were sort of facetiously saying you have to bring it to a board. Well, a lot of Salt Lake has already been surveyed for historic resources. Each building has already been assigned a category. We agree sometimes and we disagree sometimes, but you know, there's already some metrics out there that could be applied to those rankings rather than metrics, I guess. But anyways, some good ideas and needed all around. And you don't see this local historic districts being precluded from participating in this, I presume.
Absolutely not.
No.
Okay.
Not.
And what about, I think of poor houses on about 6th East and I think it's 6th East and about 2nd South. There's a bunch of big houses that have been converted to apartments, and there may not be a change of use. Is there any way that this can apply in some fashion, but they're deteriorating rapidly because they're just slums? What can you say? And I think how can those kind of properties benefit from some of this if it wasn't a change of use? I mean, does adaptive reuse have to be by definition it is, but does it have to be a change of use? I mean, is there some? That's maybe another dangerous concept.
We'll take that into consideration. I will say one of the things that we don't want to do is, for example, we certainly don't want to start seeing a lot of our existing historic buildings being converted to, especially when they're residential, single family in nature, being converted to other things. So that there's a balance there. So I said, yeah, we'd look at other historic districts. There are some historic districts that have no existing commercial buildings in them, no other uses other than residential. I don't think that we'd try to find a way so that it doesn't necessarily apply there. So that's just one of the nuances we'll have to figure out.
The adaptive, well, I don't know, would an adaptive reuse ordinance allow you to circumvent the underlying existing zoning? Or I would assume you'd still have to comply with at least the use, or not?
Probably. I think that's right. I think one of the things that we're trying to do with right now our adaptive reuse ordinance that applies to landmark sites, for example, it says you can change from a residential use to a non-residential use, but well, what if you're one type of residential use and it might be a different type of residential use in there, kind of a thing, and it has a minimum building square footage of 7,000 square feet, which it works great for a lot of our old, ward houses and churches and things like that. Doesn't necessarily work so great for, one of the issues that I know Charles has heard about is if somebody is in a single family home and that single family dwelling that's also a landmark site that has a great accessory building in the back that they wanted to convert to a second unit. Right now they couldn't do that under our existing, and so I think we'd be looking at some of those types of things. Anything that we can do to kind of promote the preservation of our older buildings is that's our ultimate goal.
Super. Thank you, David. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? See you on, I don't know what date will it be. September? What?
September something.
First Thursday in September.
Everybody was saying, I didn't have anything.